today Peter comes to Jesus and he asks him a question. If one of my brothers or sisters sins against me, if they offend me, should I forgive them? How many times should I forgive them? 7 times. And I don't know about you, but there should be this pause that happens there as we imagine Jesus' expression when Peter comes up and does this. Because Peter comes up with some really off-the-wall questions, and I can just imagine his face as he thinks, is this the same guy that was with me all this time? There's got to be a note of exasperation as he deals with this disciple who just doesn't ever seem to quite get it. Because at the heart of Jesus' message, ever and always, is forgiveness. It's the thing that he comes and proclaims. It's the sign of the kingdom of heaven coming on earth. There's that moment early on in the story when all of the disciples and all of the crowds were gathered together in this small house. And there were people, Jesus was healing people. He was laying his hands on them and healing the blind. He was healing the lame. He was healing the sick. And so people were streaming in. And there was this person who was not able to walk. And so his 4 friends picked him up and carried him to the top of the house, and as the house has had this opening in the roof, they let him down on his bed mat down into the room so that the person could be healed, because that person believed that if Jesus healed him, he would be healed. But what does Jesus do when he encounters this person? The first thing he does is he forgives him his sins. Yes, he goes on to heal the person, but Jesus makes a point to say that forgiveness is far more powerful than we could ever imagine. It's even more important than the healing of the body. Forgiveness is greater than that. And then, what was the response of the people when Jesus said that I forgive you your sins? Does anybody remember that story? Some people were in awe and amazement. Other people began to shake their heads and say, who is this guy that says that he can forgive sins? Who does he think he is? Now, Jesus knows who he is. He's the Son of God. And he really can forgive sins. But they look at him and say, this is blasphemy. How could he do that? And their reaction to Jesus forgiving sins is the very beginning of their looking at him and beginning to plot that way to Calvary. They're already beginning to think, we've got to get rid of this guy. He's a threat to us. And so we see in this story the power of forgiveness and also the threat of forgiveness for some people. Forgiveness is that powerful. Jesus goes on as he goes through his ministry and he continues to proclaim forgiveness. And so it's important for us to realize that this is at the very heart of his ministry. And so when Peter asks him this question, how many times should I forgive my brother or sister? Jesus pauses for a moment and says not just 7 times, but 77 times, or it could be translated 70 times 7 times. In other words, it's a very large number of times that we need to keep forgiving because forgiveness is that important. And then he goes into a story. And I think anytime Jesus goes into a parable or a story, he does it with the idea of creating a space. Because when we listen to a story, we're taken out of our present circumstances and we are allowed to envision the world in a new way. And he gives a parable, a story of the kingdom of heaven. And he likens it to a king who calls his servants to account. You know, there are these servants or serfs who serve the king, and they might be in charge of accounts, and they might be distributing funds. And so there's this one person that's brought before the king who owes the king 10,000 talents, which is a mind-bogglingly, staggeringly large number. That would be like saying you owe $100 million. And I don't know about you, but I don't think that serf has the capacity in any way, shape, or form to pay back the debt that he owes. There's no way he's going to be able to do it. And so he falls on his knees and says, please, Lord, have mercy on me. Forgive me. And in the story, the king does. That's an enormous debt to forgive, but he does. He not only says, I'll spare your life, I forgive you the debt. It has been canceled. You're free. You're free to go. Now, in this story, if it were you or me, we probably would have come bouncing out of that room, feeling about it so elated that we'd be walking on air. Oh my God, I can't believe he just forgave me $100 million. We can't imagine that. So here's this person who's been forgiven this great debt. But upon finding a fellow servant, remembers that this person still owes him, a couple $1,000. And he goes up to him and he says, I demand that payment now. And the person says the same words that he does. Have mercy on me, I'll pay you. But he doesn't do it. He throws the guy into prison for that. And the word gets back to the king. The king calls him to account. and he's stunned. How can you, when you've been forgiven so much, do this to another person, to a fellow servant? How could you do this? And so by his very own judgment, by the judgment that that servant gave to the other servant, he himself is judged. And so he has to go back and repay all of his debt. And it's a very powerful and profound story. And I think whenever we see a story like this, it's a story that's intended to allow us to think about the consequences of what we do. It's not an after-the-fact judgment, but it is a proactive warning or instruction to say we need to think about the importance of forgiveness, that it is that important. And we need to realize the magnitude of which we have already been forgiven. Now in this story, Jesus is saying this to Peter. And I think he's giving Peter the moment at a very critical time in the life of Peter to think about the importance of forgiveness, because Peter is going to need that forgiveness later on. As you follow the rest of the story, when Jesus is handed over to the authorities, when Jesus is put up on the cross, Peter denies him 3 times. And you can imagine what that must have felt like afterwards as he realized what he had done. But then maybe he also realized the magnitude for which God has already forgiven him and the grace of God. And we see that evident in the story as Peter continues to grow in grace because of it. He gets that message that forgiveness is important. And he realizes the magnitude to which he himself has been forgiven. And I think that's true for us as well. It's very easy to hold on to the pain of what somebody else has done to us. When somebody has hurt us or injured us or offended us in some way, that pain stays with us and we hold on to it. And it's like a chain that binds us from one to the other. And unless we're able to let go of that chain, it will continue to bring pain. If we do not forgive, it continues to bring pain. But God's desire is for all people to be liberated. And at the root of the word forgiveness in the Greek, it literally is the image of letting go. And so when we forgive, what we are doing is we are letting go of that pain. We're letting go of the power of what has happened to us, bind us in the present or into the future. We're free from that if we forgive. When we forgive, it is for our own benefit and blessing because we're no longer bound by those things. And that's God's desire for us. God's desire for each person is to live with the kind of freedom that he always intended for us to do. And we can only do that when we begin to forgive as a practice. As I think about this story, I'm reminded of just the importance of how much we have already been forgiven. And when I look at my own life and realize all the things that the Lord has forgiven me, how can it not open my heart to the possibility of letting others be forgiven as a result of it? That's our call as a people, is to learn to live into that forgiveness, that desire for healing, and to know that it's there. It's an extraordinary story, I think, and a reminder of the incredible forgiveness of God in our lives. Amen.